And we are here with our friends from Boston Public School Department to review central budgets for BPS FY20. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing, both being broadcast and recorded on Comcast Channel 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. Please silence your electronic devices. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing and would appreciate it if you would sign in. The sign-in sheets are to my left by the door. We ask that you state your name, affiliation, and residence, and please check the box yes if you do wish to testify. This budget review will encompass approximately 34 hearings over roughly the next 6 weeks. We strongly encourage residents, whether here in the chamber or at home, to take a moment to engage in this process by giving testimony for the record. You can do this in several ways. Come to one of the hearings and give public testimony. Come to the hearing dedicated to public testimony on Tuesday, June 4th, anytime from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. We will be here at least for that amount of time, and we will stay longer if need be. You can also send your testimony to the Committee on Ways and Means, Boston City Council, 5th floor, Boston City Hall, Boston 02201, or email the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov. We are here again to review the central office budget, central budgets as it pertains to dockets 0622 through 0625. Orders for the FY20 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, annual appropriation for the school department, appropriation for other post-employment benefits, and appropriation for certain transportation and public realm improvements, as well as dockets 0626 through 0628, capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. Before I introduce the rest of my colleagues, I have a statement to read into the record. Councilor Siomo, I regret to inform you that I will be missing today's hearing on Council Ways and Means docket 0622 through 0628, FY20 budget, BPS administration, and central office budgets on Thursday, April 25th, 2019 at 3 p.m. in the Ionella Chamber due to a personal matter. Sincerely, Councilor Matt O'Malley, District 6. We are also joined by the Chairman of Education, my friend at-large Councilor Anissa Sabi-George. To my far left, Councilor Ed Flynn and Councilor Andrea Campbell. So with that, I will hand it over to Eleanor and your team. Thanks, Eleanor.
Thank you, Councilor. We had 2 planned topics for this afternoon, and with your indulgence, we'd like to add a brief third one. The 2 planned topics on central office. One, Mary Driscoll will give us an overview of how our central team is supporting our schools, and in particular, trying to differentiate support so we give greater support to our highest need schools. Nate Cooter will provide us detail on total central administration spending by department. And the third item that we wanted to very briefly add today is to talk briefly about equity. This was a question posed to our team on Tuesday, and it is so central to everything that we do. It is really the lens with which we think about all of our work in the Boston Public Schools. And so Dr. Charles Granson also joined as our Chief Academic Officer to open with a few words on that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. We at BPS are intentional about the idea that the work that involves equity is central to our overall work, and it's not work that lives particularly in one department. And so we all own it as senior leaders and throughout the system. Our definition of equity that we use and that is infused in our work and that we hope that you see throughout today's presentations and future presentations is as follows. To advance educational equity, the Boston Public Schools must provide access to opportunities and resources to each and every child by intentionally recognizing and eliminating historical barriers and considering the predictability of personal and academic success based on race, background, and/or circumstance. To achieve that equity, the district's approach must incorporate targeted universalism, a strategy that addresses all students' learning and flourishing by particularly focuses on actively identifying and supporting our highest needs students in schools. And so one of the pieces that we know came up was around making sure that we're intentional around barriers. I think that that's work that we aspire to do in partnership with each of you and through the broader community and with the staff in Boston Public Schools and the families.
Great, thank you. Before I hand it over, I just want to acknowledge that we're joined by Councilor Josh Acom as well. Thanks.
To Nate. Two more. Perfect. One more. Nate. Yeah. So just to frame where we're in the conversation, Nate, do you mind clicking us forward one more slide? You now have seen this slide 3 times, so I apologize for some redundancy, but just to frame where we are in today's presentation, again, there are 4 broad categories of our spending. The previous hearing earlier this afternoon touched on our direct school expenses and school budgets. Over the course of the coming hearings, we will go through a number of the areas that are what we call school services budgeted centrally, as we talk to you about transportation, special education, et cetera. And our focus for this afternoon's hearing is on the central administration. That's the $62 million that you see highlighted here that represents 5.4% of our general fund spending. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Driscoll.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I'm going to talk about a couple of existing and new supports that we have within the central office budget that are, again, really focused on taking an equity-based approach to the work and ensuring that our highest needs students and our highest needs schools are getting a differentiated level of support. So last year at this time, we came to you and talked about a shift we were making to the way we organized our schools into networks, some of which are quite small, as few as 6 schools being supported by an academic superintendent, and some of which are quite large, and those are being also supported by a single academic superintendent with the assistance of some strong lead principals who help with the learning for their peers in those networks. I'm also going to talk some about support that we're giving to schools who, in DESE's new accountability framework, are required to write plans for next year for rapid improvement, and then a little bit also about investments we're making in science instruction. Next slide. So the network structure, as I explained last year, is based on research, national research that's been done around how to best support rapid improvement for schools, particularly the highest need schools. And one of the key levers to that improvement is the support of the principal supervisor, who acts as both an executive coach as well as a instructional expert for the school leader and the team and their teams. So we have, this year we launched networks with 4 elementary networks that are quite small, receiving a lot of support from both an academic superintendent and a team of liaisons. In the high schools, we have 1 small network that's getting a lot of support, and then the other schools grouped in larger networks. In the coming school year, because we've gotten really strong feedback from school leaders about the efficacy of that support, we're making investments to have additional academic superintendents that will allow us to narrow the span of control so that the leaders that are currently in those much larger networks will get more regular opportunities to get coaching and support from their academic superintendents. We're also Next slide. We're also continuing to invest in leadership development. We talked a little bit this morning about our partnership with the University of Virginia, which has a nationally recognized program for training school leaders and central office teams in how to do turnaround work well. We have 6 schools that are in that partnership, and we will continue to invest in that partnership in the coming year. We're seeing some really early indicators of success with that work, and we've been able to take the lessons learned from that one single network partnering with University of Virginia and apply it to other schools across the district. We also are partnering with one of our higher education partners close to home, the Lynch School of Education at Boston College, and they have worked with us to train these principal leaders, the six sitting principals who act as facilitators and conveners of professional learning communities for their peers. So those principal leaders have the opportunity to mentor an aspiring principal through the Lynch Leadership Program, and they also receive executive coaching from the Lynch Leadership so that they become really excellent facilitators of adult learning. I mentioned the work with schools that are writing DESI plans. Under the new accountability framework that was introduced last year, schools that are below the 10th percentile are deemed to be in need of focused and targeted support. And schools below the 5th percentile are writing DESI-required comprehensive plans that are focused on the 4 turnaround practices. DESI provided support to those schools in terms of the planning process, so teams within the schools have been supported to write the plans, but however, they're not providing support for implementation of those plans. And so we've set aside a fund of $750,000 that will allow those schools to actually implement the research-based practices that they've identified as key levers in next year's work. And then our final investment is in science instruction, and this will be an opportunity to bring our teachers in grades 3 through 8 materials that are aligned with the new version of the science standards. In 2016, we got a new set of national science standards, and the materials that we currently are using in our science classrooms are not completely aligned with those standards. And so this investment will provide curriculum units, increased instructional time, teacher and leader professional development, and also just a shift in how we're teaching science to our students in grades 3 through 8.
I'm going to talk about our central administration. At the opening, Eleanor showed the slide that had the 4 main categories, the broad categories of our spending. We're going to dive in a little bit now onto the central administration budget. I want to note at the start that there are 2 ways to think about the central office budgets. The first is in our accounting system, in our public budget that we report responsibility centers that are identified as either schools or central offices. In the central office category of those budgets, that includes a lot of spending that, as Eleanor's mentioned in prior hearings, are direct school expenses, things like custodians or facilities expenses that are on a central budget for management but are actually located in schools. The data that I'm going to talk about now is really diving into that 5.4% that is true central office and is used is how we define it for the purposes of when we think about when some people may refer to what's in the bowling building. The first slide shows the stacked bar chart of the 4 categories. This shows the relative size of the investments by the 4 categories that Eleanor mentioned. The small orange sliver is the central office, which represents 5.4%, as we mentioned, of our overall budget. That's broken into 8 different divisions, the largest of which is academics and student support team, or asset. And this is appropriately so because this is the division most responsible for supporting instruction and supporting our students, including departments such as special education and the Office of English Learners. For each of these different divisions, they break down into 43 different central offices. And one of the things that we're most excited about, and anyone who's a budget advocate and follower, a fan of the BPS budget process, We've really brought a lot of transparency this year to our budget process by identifying over 115 specific activities that the central office does. And this can all be found on our website, on the bostonpublicschools.org/budget. There's now a new tool that allows people to dive in and see, and it says specifically what the departments do. So you don't have to guess what kind of activities the Office of English Language Learners are doing to support our students. It's broken down on that website. The next slide shows a breakdown by those different divisions. Each of the columns is a different division, and each of the different boxes is a specific unit or office or department within that division. And the size of the square on this MECCO chart is the relative size of each of the investments. So the larger the square that you see, the larger the overall investment. The biggest thing that you'll note is that business services, which includes our employee benefits, is all budgeted centrally as that large red square in the center. You can break it down and we can dive into each individual one. Of our central office departments, only 12 are considered 100% central office. This includes critical services for running our billion-dollar organization. Many of our central offices have a blend of school services budgeted centrally, of non-BPS student services, as we've mentioned before, and then the pure central office function. So you'll see a blend within the different departments. And there are 21 different central offices in BPS that manage over $1 million. So I'm going to leave the summary at that. The last slide that we've provided, of course, is a link to the resources that are available online. I can't emphasize enough the level of work our team has done, and I can say this because I wasn't primarily involved in the project, but our team has done a lot of work to identify and classify each of the individual activities at departments and put it out there publicly for people to see. And it's broken down not only by the cost of that service and a description of the service, but you can find out how many students benefit from that specific service and what the cost per pupil is, right down to how much it costs per pupil for the superintendent.
Great, thank you. Councilor Sabi George.
Thank you, Chair. With all of these departments, Ellen, maybe we could leave it on that other slide. I guess it's not on TV anymore, but that other slide, the last slide, I think is probably the most helpful. Thank you. I think that it's great that we can go in and see interactively how these departments are related to the work that we do to serve children. But I think it's, a theme that I hear regularly when I visit schools is school teachers and administrators not understanding what's happening in the central office and a real disconnect between what's happening in central office and how they can't connect with sometimes the people they need to connect with. And it's a theme I've heard from my own time teaching, and now I continue to hear when I'm visiting schools across our district. Can we talk a little bit about that disconnect and how we can improve those relationships?
So I would say in the structure that we have now, the academic superintendent and the operational superintendent are intended to be the key connectors between central office and the schools. And I think because that team lives kind of in the in-between, often schools don't perceive them as a central office resource themselves, but they are the first line of contact. So when a school has a problem, if it's an instructional problem, they're going to their academic superintendent. If it's a problem with a bus or a facilities issue, they're going to their operational superintendent. And then those two people are charged then with making sure that whatever follow-up needs to happen from central office does happen.
All right. And then I know that, one of the other sort of themes that I hear is that there's this constant process of reorganization within the central office. And I get that that's partly due to the effort of clarifying what people are doing and why they're doing certain roles. But that's, something that, again, that we continue to hear and has been brought up a number of times, even in the most recent search for our new superintendent. Can you talk a little bit about how we're evaluating and measuring productivity within the central office? We understand how it's done at the school level based on testing data. We know how teachers are evaluated through their evaluation tool. How are we measuring staff and measuring productivity in the central office?
We have relied primarily on surveying our school leaders For a lot of the services we offer, they are our customers, and so we ask them how they're doing, how we're doing. The last survey we did was this fall. We haven't done it on an exact annual basis. I think it had been 18 months prior since our fall survey, but I'd like to see us doing it annually in the fall.
Thank you. And then something that came up, and this will be something I talk about in the human capital hearing that we have in the next week or so, but another issue, we talk a lot about student residency, which I have a question related to that, but staff residency. We've talked to Emily about this before, but within that central office, there are many, many employees, many staff in central office that are utilizing the education or the teacher exemption that the state has around residency. Can we talk a little bit about the residency within that central office and that exemption?
Yeah, I think we're all looking at, I do think that might be a better question for Emily. Unfortunately, she's.
So I'll save it for next week.
So I think we can follow up on
Okay.
that question.
All right, perfect. And then within the residency department, that's investigating students, really their families that are falsifying documents about residency in the city of Boston. Can we talk a little bit about that office, the work of that office over the last year or two, and then the billing piece that comes out of that? So we think about that's a very direct effort of the central office that has the ability to create some revenue through finding families that are falsifying documents.
Yeah, so the work of the residency verification is now under Carolyn McNeil's purview. And the residency investigators have really, I think in a couple ways have developed a more rigorous process for evaluating and notifying and then billing families. So when a family is identified that has been sending their student to the Boston Public Schools who is no longer living in the city or maybe didn't live in the city, then they do receive a bill that's followed up by the finance team and to make sure that we receive those funds. I will say it's not primarily meant to be a revenue generator. It's meant to really make sure that the best of our schools are available for our residents. And I know there's been an interesting partnership between the Office of Instructional Technology, who's able to leverage registration data and detect anomalies. And I see Rob is up, Carolyn's in his office, so I'll.
Yep, thank you. I would only add that this is an effort in an office that we're really taking extremely seriously. The issue of making sure that Boston Public School seats are for Boston residents is, I know, an important issue to you and to all the council. It was when I was here, an issue I took very seriously. So it is something that we are making sure from an operations perspective we're working very hard on. It's important to note that Steve Hickey, and I want to give him a public shout out, has retired officially from that position as our investigator. He did amazing work for over 10 years, really brought the office up to a whole new level. We are in the process of finalizing a new person for that position within residency, and we're going to anticipate that person being hired soon. They will again be under the leadership of Carolyn McNeil, who does work very closely within that, managing that office, and assists with reviewing all the issues, all the tips that we get, following through on the investigations. It is a very thorough process that ensures a very fair outcome for those people who we are in fact finding out are cheating the system. And we only expect that as the new superintendent comes on, Superintendent Perrell and Dr. Chang before her, all also took this issue very seriously. So we anticipate that this issue will not only continue to be taken serious, but will grow even further because it's an issue that we know is that important. We are looking at creative, I just want to add one other thing, creative new ways to give Carolyn tools to take the job even more seriously. She's working with the Registry of Motor Vehicles on a new computer system to be able to help. These are all things that help assist her in the investigatory process and her investigator in the investigatory process. And I want to say that while Steve has been gone and retired, we haven't skipped a beat. Carolyn has taken that responsibility on. She is actively investigating all of the cases herself as well and following up administratively with other members of our team, including we're working and looking for new innovative ways with our finance team around the invoice pieces at Glore from our procurement team and our business services team is looking at how we can better streamline the fact that we're invoicing people, making sure it's getting to the right people and that they, in fact, do have to be held accountable and pay for whatever the price tag is.
How much have we collected from invoicing families?
We can definitely get you that data. That's
I think I know, I think it's just over $50,000.
How
but,
much?
Just over $50,000, but I would need to confirm that.
Yep.
I think last year at this time, we were at like 80 or 88,000.
That's right.
So I hope that we continue to be aggressive in, as you called them, Rob, and I agree with it, the cheaters of the system. And then I'd also like to see if there is a way that we could take those funds and put them into some sort of revolving account that could then be used to cover the expense of some of the work that happens within that department. I think it's very direct connection between those funds. And hopefully we get to a point where families realize they cannot falsify residency requirements. And it oftentimes, in some of the cases that I've been aware of, it's families with means that they can have multiple addresses. Again, students that are experiencing homelessness and are sheltered outside of the city are not held to the residency requirement. They're protected under federal law. These are typically families that have some substantial means in order to scam the system. So I'd like to follow up with that conversation at some point on the invoicing, realizing the true dollar amounts that we could gain from this work, and then potentially exploring a revolving fund so that money can stay within the department and support that work.
I think we welcome that conversation, any new ideas that can help us strengthen even further. And I would just close saying that the issue is so important. It's not just the exam schools, right? There are so many of our Boston public schools that are doing so well. We find that there are people who are fraudulently trying to get into other schools as well, not just the exam schools. When people hear of this issue, they think just the exam schools, and that is a huge issue we focus on, but it's other schools as well.
It's our kindergarten, early ed, special ed program, bilingual programs.
And we're going to keep a laser-like focus on all of that.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Chair.
And we've been joined by Councilor Tim McCarthy. Let me now recognize Councilor Andrea Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. Just how many, what's the number of employees in central office?
I do have that data. Sorry, I don't have it open. If you have a second question, I'll have this answer in just a moment.
Yeah, it was just along the number and the history, has it gone up, gone down, that kind of thing. And then I was just curious, and I guess this is following up on some line of questioning by Councilor Sabi George, that during school visits, you often do hear, sometimes it's very positive, but there are moments where school leaders or teachers or staff are frustrated and they feel a disconnect between central office and the various departments, whether it's English, SEL or something else. So I'm curious, does each department have a sort of a working definition of how they view their relationship with their schools, or the central office as a whole have a definition around that? Do they define it? Is it articulated somewhere? Just so there's an understanding as to what that relationship is or should be.
We're actually in the midst of rolling out a new performance management system for the central office. We're hearing the same things, and frankly, I think we need to do better. We have also had many years where we've tried to be as lean as possible in the central office so that as many dollars as possible could go to schools. I think it's possible we've at times gone a little too far in that effort, and there's been a trade-off. Some of our school leaders have talked to us about this, where in our effort to protect classrooms and have dollars go there, that we have sometimes underinvested in the level of service we're able to provide centrally.
What would the new performance management system entail, look like?
I'm looking at Dave Murphy, who's going to come join us. He's been involved with that work and can describe it.
In the interim, I'll just say in the schools, in the central category that we mentioned, there are 439.9 FTE in the FY20 proposed budget. This is up 3 FTE, 3.5 FTE from the current budget.
Thank you. Hi, Dave.
On the central office performance evaluation system, that was an idea that had been generated initially out of the Office of Human Capital and a cross-departmental work group has come together over the course of the past year, and the sort of, it's in response to the fact that we sort of have varying systems that are currently being used in different departments. There's sort of a uniform process that was implemented and meant to be used across the central office, and then what I would describe as a slightly more antiquated system, sort of more binary of satisfactory, unsatisfactory. And so the objective in this new system is to have more of a 360 feedback cycle and to have both upward and downward feedback processes that are in place, and more of a goal-setting arrangement that is put in place between supervisors and their employees. So the idea is for it to be more comprehensive and also more uniform across departments.
Would school leaders or teachers or staff at the school level be able to give feedback on what they think that relationship is and where it's going well and where it's not going well?
Particularly for the departments that are very school-facing, which obviously we want as many offices and departments to be school-facing because that's the point of the central office. So in instances in where school leaders or other school-based personnel are engaged with central office employees, that would be a facet of it, yes.
Do they get, is there, I know this is something that is in the works.
Yep.
Currently, right now, or is there any mechanisms or processes in place for school leaders, staff, and teachers to give feedback right now?
Not necessarily from a performance evaluation system. As Eleanor stated, there are survey systems that have been put in place, and there's obviously an attempt for continuous communication amongst school-based personnel in the central office, but not necessarily tied to a personnel evaluation system, as is contemplated by this new process.
Got it. And with the surveys, what happens to those? Like what, if there's a survey system where there is some level, it's not obviously where you guys, I think, trying to go, which is great. Mm-hmm. What happens with the surveys? Does someone review them, look at them? What's sort of the next step, I guess, afterwards?
The summary slide, Dave's probably going to laugh at me. We've probably projected in front of our leadership team a dozen times in the months afterwards. We keep it in constant focus as an area, to focus us on the areas where we need to do better.
Yeah, and also I would say just trying to be as informed as possible as to how the services are being perceived at the school level. So sometimes, and frankly, we see survey data and we know that there's a particular context to the data that is coming in, that there are offices, for instance, that are only engaging with schools during difficult periods, and that can have an impact on what schools feel about those offices. But if we want to have as much context to the data as possible, and it's been useful for us to gain that perspective.
Thank you. I can wait.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councilor Zachem. Oh, you're all set. Councilor Sabi-George.
Thank you. I think we're going to be quick here. I noticed this year that we've invested or increasing our investment from the central office on the Becoming a Man program, BAM. And I wonder if, are we looking to expand BAM to every high school? Are we going to continue to fund that centrally? And then can we also talk about WOW, working on women, and what we're doing to invest in our young women?
I can speak to BAM. We are entering, next school year will be the third year of a commitment we had made with some philanthropic partners and with the BAM organization to roll it out to a set number of high schools. I think that will be an opportune time next year to assess, how's it going? Is it a good fit for Boston? It was obviously phenomenal in Chicago. It is expensive on a per pupil basis, so it requires evaluation and study. But again, the data that came out of Chicago was very powerful. Did I answer your question on BAM, Counselor?
Sure.
I'm wondering, Mary, if you have any other thoughts on supporting our female students.
Well, BAM has a sister program called WOW, working on women. And I just wonder if there's any moves to. I've got to visit BAM, and I think it's certainly impactful and powerful, but
we don't have.
The girls?
We're not yet implementing that, although within our Office of Opportunity Gaps, there was a 10 boys program, which now has become a 10 girls or a 10 young women's program in many schools, because it's very clear that the need is equally strong to engage our young women as our young men. So we don't have WOW, but we do have our 10 Girls initiative in many schools.
Were you going to add to that? Did you just come, huh?
I was going to say what Mary said.
Ditto.
What she said. What she said. And then I may have missed it when I looked down at my notes, but Nate, did you answer the question that Councilor Campbell asked about the number of people?
I
in
did.
Central office?
And I'm happy to say it again, 439.
439, I apologize.
An increase of 3 this year versus or next year versus this year.
Great, thank you. And so then, we've talked about it a number of times, but again, because it's centrally funded, if we could talk a little bit about the expansion of the ISEE prep, the exam school prep that we're doing from central office. Is that you, Mary?
Want to take it?
Sure. So there's two investments we've been making. One is around the ISEE prep program that happens in August, and through partnership with the mayor's office, we've expanded the number of seats so that there are a certain number of seats that are by invitation based on students who take the Terra Nova and score above a cut score, and then an additional approximately 300 seats that are offered to schools, particularly those schools that historically have not been sending a lot of students to exam schools, and they choose students based on things like grades, MCAS scores, and other factors that teachers identify. And then for this coming school year, we are going to be giving the ISEE exam during the school day to any sixth grader that wants to take it. We will continue to pre-register students who, based on their MCAS scores and grades, look like good candidates, but we certainly will have both an opt-in opportunity and an opt-out so that no student will be forced to take the test, but it will be accessible to all sixth graders in all schools.
Great, thank you. And then my last question is, on the slide previous to this one, you don't need to go to it, it just breaks down the central spending, and you've got a dollar amount here for the school committee. Has there been any conversation around making the stipend that's available to school committee members available to the student member of BSAC?
I have not heard that, but that's a great question. I'd be happy to look into it.
That would be great. I know that there is a continued effort by the students for the ability to vote, but at the very least, their time is the same as the adult members of the school committee, and I think their perspective almost more important. So if we could at least be looking at, and I think it's a fairly small stipend, if we could look to offer that stipend either in the same payment schedule that we give it to the adult school committee members, or perhaps as part of a graduation opportunity or something. Is Rob coming over to say something? No. Okay. That's it for me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Thank you. I want to support or go on record in supporting Councilor Sabi George's suggestion with respect to the student. And I'm looking at Ellie, my chief of staff, who used to serve in that role. And so I think she also echoes that too and was giving a wink, wink. I just have one, I guess this is a follow-up question to Councilor Sabi George's question around residency. Are folks who work in the central office required to live in the city of Boston?
No.
I don't know.
I don't know that those of us at the table have an answer. I know that Emily has had a team working on this recently, and I'm afraid we don't know the answer.
So similar to our teachers, there's no requirement right now that central office folks are required to live in the city of Boston.
We can look into it and get back to you.
Okay. That's it. Thank you, guys.
I would say through the chair, if I could say that
sure.
the central office folks are not required to live in the city. Perhaps there are a couple of positions within central office and within, obviously, the school department that are required, but there are dozens of individuals in central office that do not live in the city of Boston.
Right.
Nate and I are proud Rosendale residents.
Mary, you live in Rosendale.
We
Oh, thank you very much. Has there been conversations around changing that?
Yes, that's what the group that Emily is working on is looking at.
And is this like a working group?
I would have to look, I'd have to ask Emily to know.
Okay, no, I can wait.
But
I'm just
Councilor
curious.
Sabi George is correct. We have non-Boston residents who are part of the administration.
Okay, no, that's, well, then I think that's worth expanding the conversation to include all folks who work within BPS. But okay, thank you.
I mean, if I could be
Yeah,
the
sure,
chair, I don't
sure.
feel, I want to make sure I'm following our rules of order. It will be a topic of conversation next week. It was a topic of conversation in last year's Human Capital hearing, where we do have a breakdown of how many BPS employees live within the city and live without the city, but within that, there are some exceptions based on state law for teachers, people who very directly impact the educational experience of children. I'm paraphrasing the state law. That is interpreted in a number of different ways through central office.
And
So is there a breakdown, so there currently is, and thank you, Councilor Sabi-George, there's a breakdown currently of the folks who work for central office who live in and outside the city. Is there a breakdown for teachers as well?
There is a district-wide breakdown that I'm aware of, not divided by job type or
Okay.
bargaining unit or something like
I didn't
that.
know
Although
that.
that
Okay.
information may exist, but I think we'll have a deeper conversation about it at the Human Capital hearing. next
Thank
week.
you, thank you, thank you, guys.
Great. Do you have any
I'm all set,
follow-up?
thank you.
I just wanted to wrap up with just one question about how you're redeploying, I don't know if that's the right word, the instructionals, the superintendent's academic and operational, and how that's impacting the budget and staffing levels.
So we're planning to add an additional, a number of additional academic superintendents, so those will be additional FTEs. I'm not sure, I don't know.
I can answer the budget side of it. So I may have mentioned on Tuesday, we have 2 additional FTEs for central office to reflect changes that we're making in the network structure. Those are investments that we think will be directly positive impacts for schools and students. We are making, any other adjustments that we make will be budget neutral.
Okay.
And in terms of adding additional people, we're very much keeping in mind the idea that we don't want to be changing people's lines of supervision or who's doing the support. So the addition will be in the networks that are very large, where currently the academic superintendent is only getting out there once every 6 or so weeks. And so it will mean a shift in relationships for some school leaders, but ultimately it will lead to a deeper relationship with the academic superintendent. And operational superintendents we don't have any plans for shifting the way that they're deployed.
And the reason being, and again, just recalling, you saw some inequities with workload maybe and demand on some academic superintendents versus others.
Well, we set it up so that the tasks were slightly different. The academic superintendents supporting the larger networks they have the support of lead principals who, for instance, are planning all of the professional development for the school leaders in those networks. Okay. We are making the addition mainly because we heard from the school leaders how valuable it is to have the instructional thought partnership of an academic superintendent. And in the large networks, they're only able to get that maybe once every 6 weeks. And when we do our team surveys specifically just about the work of our team, and it was very clear that that was something that school leaders desired more of. And so by adding the position, we'll be able to provide more of that.
Right. Okay, great.
Do a little promo?
Oh,
Yeah.
a little promo before we adjourn.
So today, Boston Public Schools had the Talk, Read, and Play rhyme flash mob across our city. So BPS brought the council some great T-shirts. I just want to.
And they're under.
And I believe you said you were going to rhyme for us, weren't you, Counselor? As
I
part
don't know
of
if you want to hear my poem about the BPS budget.
I would love to.
Lots of beeps and.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for your time, attention, and testimony. This hearing is adjourned.